Have you ever had a moment so perfect, so saturated with happiness, that you wished you could bottle it and keep it forever? I had one on the night of my brother's 30th birthday. The air in our parents' Chicago home was thick with the scent of vanilla cake and old love, the kind that settles into the very bones of a house. I watched as the light from 30 candles danced in Leo's eyes, reflecting a future that seemed as bright and limitless as the city skyline outside the window. My father, Richard, stood with his arm draped around my mother, Elizabeth, his posture exuding a quiet pride that was his trademark. They were a unit, a fortress of grace and success against which my brother and I had always safely leaned. In that moment, surrounded by the warm glow and the low murmur of happy conversation, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. I was Kira, the cherished daughter, the successful architect, the adored younger sister. My life was a blueprint drawn to perfection. Then Leo, my brilliant, kind-hearted Leo, tapped his glass for a toast. The room fell into a hush. "I wouldn't be here, turning the big 3-0," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "without the two people who gave me life not once, but twice." He looked at our parents, and my mother pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. "But there's someone else," he continued, his gaze finding mine across the room. "My sister Kira, my other half. Did you ever wonder what holds a family together? Is it blood, or is it something more?" His words wrapped around my heart. My other half. It was our special phrase, a testament to a bond that went deeper than sibling affection. It was a bond forged in the sterile, quiet halls of a hospital 2 decades ago. As Leo spoke, the present momentarily dissolved, and a phantom memory surfaced, as it often did. The feeling of a scratchy, too-big hospital gown against my 5-year-old skin. The antiseptic smell that clung to everything. My parents' faces hovering over me, their smiles both bright and strained. "You're being so brave for Leo," Mom had whispered, stroking my hair. "You're helping him get better. You're our little hero." I hadn't understood the specifics then, only the gravity and the importance. I knew my brother was sick, and I was the key to his recovery. The brief stay in the hospital, the pinch of a needle, it wasn't a trauma. It was my coronation. I was a hero. That single story became the cornerstone of my identity, the proudest chapter in the perfect narrative of our perfect family. A wave of applause pulled me back to the present. Leo was blowing out his candles, a single, powerful breath extinguishing all 30 flames. The room erupted in cheers. My mother came to my side, her hand finding mine and squeezing it with a familiar, firm pressure. "We are so lucky to have you," she murmured, her eyes shining with what I had always believed were tears of pure love. "You truly completed our family." Her words were a balm, reinforcing everything I knew to be true. Later that night, as I drove back to my downtown apartment, the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and silver. I replayed the evening in my mind. The laughter, the love, the overwhelming sense of belonging. I had been chosen by these wonderful people. Adopted as an infant, I never felt anything less than their own. In fact, I often felt more. I wasn't just a daughter. I was the missing piece, the answer to a prayer, the hero who had saved their son. I thought I knew the story of my life. What if I told you that the most important stories are the ones we are told, not the ones we live? How long does a perfect moment last? Mine lasted about 3 weeks. After the warm glow of Leo's birthday party faded, a subtle chill began to creep into the edges of our lives. It started with a phone call. Leo's voice, usually so full of energy, sounded thin and distant, like a radio station struggling to find its signal. He said he was just run down, tired from his teaching job. End of semester burnout, He'd laughed, but the sound was hollow. I tried to believe him. We all did. But then he canceled our weekly dinner. The following week, he backed out of a weekend trip we'd planned for months. The excuses were always plausible, but they began to stack up, forming a wall between the brother I knew and the stranger who answered his phone. My mother's worry manifested as a flurry of activity. She made him soup, she bought him vitamins, she called him 3 times a day, her voice a little too bright, a little too cheerful. It was a performance, and we were all her unwilling audience. Do you know what true fear looks like? It isn't a scream. It's my father, Richard, standing by the living room window, staring out at the manicured lawn but seeing nothing. His stoicism, once a source of comfort, now seemed like a fragile dam holding back a flood of terror. The unspoken truth hung in the air of that perfect house, thick and suffocating. The ghost we all thought had been vanquished 2 decades ago was stirring. The word leukemia was a phantom limb, an ache we all felt but dared not acknowledge. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. I went to Leo's apartment unannounced, armed with groceries and a forced smile. The man who opened the door was a pale, shadowed version of my brother. There were faint purplish bruises on his arms he couldn't explain, and dark circles under his eyes that no amount of sleep could erase. We didn't talk about it. We talked about his students, about a new building project I was working on, about everything and nothing. But the silence between our words was deafening. That evening, my father called him. I don't know what was said, but the next morning, Leo had an appointment with his old oncologist. Waiting for the news was a special kind of hell. We sat in the hospital's sterile waiting area, a place I hadn't seen since I was 5, yet every detail felt seared into my memory. The faint smell of bleach, the hushed voices, the way time seemed to stretch and warp. My parents sat side by side, not touching, their shared history of fear creating a chasm between them. When the doctor finally called us into his office, the world seemed to narrow to the space of that small, beige room. I focused on a generic landscape painting on the wall, a placid lake scene that felt like a cruel joke. Then came the words. Have you ever been hit by a wave so powerful it knocks the air from your lungs and you don't know which way is up? The doctor's voice was calm, compassionate, but his words were a tsunami. The leukemia has returned. He said more things, clinical, sharp-edged terms like aggressive relapse and acute myeloid. But all I heard was a roar in my ears. The perfect blueprint of my life was being ripped to shreds. The tragedy we thought we had survived was just the opening act. The real story, the one written in blood and bone, was only just beginning. Have you ever noticed how panic has its own sound? It's not the sound of screaming, it's the crushing silence that comes after the bomb has dropped. In our house, that silence was punctuated by the frantic, useless noise of my mother on the phone, her voice a shrill bird against a sky of doom. My father retreated into his study, the heavy oak door closing with a finality that felt like a tomb ceiling. The perfect family from Leo's 30th birthday party had shattered into 3 terrified individuals, and I felt like a ghost haunting the hallways of my own life. The doctors had been clear. Chemo first. To try and beat the disease into submission, but the only real cure, the only long-term hope, was another bone marrow transplant. The word donor hung in the air, a single, terrifying question mark. Hope, fragile as it was, first landed on my parents. They were tested immediately, a frantic rush of appointments and blood draws. For 48 agonizing hours, we pretended this might work. We spoke in hypotheticals, clinging to the 1 in a million chance that would let me remain on the sidelines. But I knew, didn't I? Deep down, in a place I didn't dare examine, I knew they wouldn't be a match. When the call came, I was in the kitchen, staring at a bowl of perfect, untouched fruit. I watched my mother listen to the phone, her face crumbling like a sandcastle against a rising tide. She hung up without a word. My father emerged from his study, his expression asking the question his lips couldn't form. My mother just shook her head. And then, as if pulled by an invisible string, both of their heads turned to me. In that moment, I wasn't their daughter. I was the answer. I was the emergency plan, the fail-safe they had kept in reserve for 2 decades. My mother took a step toward me, her hands clasped at her chest. "Thank God," she breathed, the words rushing out on a wave of relief so profound it was almost violent. "Thank God we have you." Why did it sound less like a prayer of gratitude and more like the satisfied declaration of a gambler who had just won an impossible bet? The strangeness of her tone, the sheer intensity of her relief, pricked at the edge of my consciousness, a tiny splinter under the skin. But the thought was fleeting, washed away by the tide of necessity. My brother was dying. The rest was just noise. Before the silence could stretch, before their desperate, hopeful eyes could bore any deeper into me, I heard my own voice, calm and clear. "Of course," I said. "I'll do it. When do I need to come in for testing?" There was no doubt, no hesitation. It was the easiest and most obvious statement I had ever made in my life. It felt like breathing. It felt like coming home. As I made the call to schedule my own appointment, a strange sense of peace settled over me. The chaos receded. Here, at last, was a problem I could solve, a blueprint I could follow. For the second time in my life, my brother needed me to be a hero. My love for him was an absolute, a fundamental law of my universe, and in that moment, I believed that was the only truth that mattered. I would save him. That's who I was. It was my purpose. The preliminary screening was held in a part of the hospital that felt less like a place of healing and more like a laboratory. The air was cool and still, and the only sounds were the quiet hum of machines and the soft squeak of my own shoes on the linoleum. I felt a sense of calm purpose. This was a place of data, of blood types and human leukocyte antigens. Here, my love for Leo could be distilled into a measurable, tangible gift. I was ready. I was certain. Have you ever been so sure of something, only to have a single quiet question unravel your entire reality? The hematologist was not the harried young resident I was expecting. Dr. Alistair Finch was an older man, with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the thousands of stories that had passed through his office. They were kind, but tired. He reviewed my chart, his fingers tracing lines of text that summarized my existence. "So, Kira," he began, his voice gentle, "I see you're no stranger to this process. You were a donor for your brother once before, when you were just 5 years old." He looked up at me over the rim of his glasses. "That's a remarkable thing." "My parents always said I was his little hero," I replied, a familiar warmth spreading through my chest. It was the story I knew by heart. It was the story of me. Dr. Finch nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "I'm sure they did," he said, and there was an inflection in his voice I couldn't quite decipher. He leaned back in his chair. "Your file also notes that you were adopted. That's a wonderful thing, too. A family built on choice." I smiled, relaxing a bit. He seemed so personable, so caring. "I was lucky," I said. "They're the most incredible people I know." Then he asked the question that tilted the world on its axis. "Do you know why they chose you specifically?" The question was so unexpected, so strange, that I blinked. What did he mean? People choose a child to love, to raise. They don't choose them for a reason. I don't understand," I stammered. "They wanted a daughter. They found me." His expression didn't change, but the sympathy in his eyes deepened, and that's what terrified me. It was a look of profound pity. He wasn't just making small talk, he was trying to tell me something. "Kira," he said, his voice dropping to an almost whisper. "You are an adult now, and you are about to undergo a serious medical procedure for the second time. You have a right to the full context of your own medical history." He leaned forward, his tired eyes locking onto mine, and the casual atmosphere of the room evaporated, replaced by a sudden chilling gravity. "Ask your parents to show you the documents. All of them. The hospital records from when you were a child, and the records for Leo's first transplant. You have a right to know the whole story." Have you ever been haunted by a question? Not a simple one, but a question that sinks its teeth into you and refuses to let go. Dr. Finch's words, "Do you know why they chose you?" played on a loop in my head. A malevolent earworm burrowed deep in my consciousness. The drive home from the hospital was a blur of traffic lights and concrete canyons. My own apartment, usually my sanctuary, felt cold and alien. The perfect blueprint of my life now had a smudge on it, a single, inexplicable mark that drew my entire focus. That night, sleep was a stranger. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to reason with the panic blooming in my chest. It was a misunderstanding. A tired old doctor making a strange comment. My parents loved me. Their love was the sun my entire world orbited around. But the question remained, a shadow eclipsing that sun. Why did he look at me with such pity? What whole story did he think I was missing? By 2 in the morning, I couldn't stand it anymore. The need to know was a physical thirst. I drove back to my parents' house, the quiet suburban streets feeling like a foreign country. I let myself in with my key, the silence of the sleeping house amplifying the frantic beat of my heart. What do you do when the foundation of your world begins to crack? You either run away or you start digging. I went straight to my father's study. It was his domain, a place of order and leather-bound books, a room that always smelled faintly of his cologne and quiet authority. And it was where he kept the important things. My hands were shaking as I began to search. I started with the mahogany filing cabinet, my fingers sliding over tabs labeled taxes, insurance, Leo, school. Nothing. It was all too neat, too ordinary. The secret, if there was one, wouldn't be filed away alphabetically. My eyes scanned the room and landed on a heavy oak credenza against the far wall. Inside, behind a stack of old financial ledgers, was a small, dark wood box. It was old, antique even, and it was locked. A cold dread, sharp and absolute, washed over me. This was it. My heart hammered against my ribs. There was no good reason to lock away adoption papers. I found a heavy silver letter opener on my father's desk, its pointed tip feeling like a weapon in my hand. For a moment, I hesitated. This was a violation, a point of no return. But the doctor's sympathetic eyes flashed in my mind, and I jammed the tip into the seam of the box. With a sickening crack, the old lock gave way. I lifted the lid, my breath catching in my throat. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, were 2 thick folders. The first had LEO written on the tab in my father's precise block lettering. I opened it and saw a history I already knew: hospital reports, doctor's notes, a chronicle of his long fight. My hands, slick with sweat, reached for the second folder. My name, Kira, was written on the tab. Relief washed over me for a fraction of a second. Here it was, the story of how I came to be theirs. I opened it, expecting to see the familiar, sterile documents of an adoption agency. But that's not what I found. The top page was not a birth certificate or a legal decree. It was a letterhead, crisp and professional. Sterling Investigations, Inc. Beneath it, a title: Project Marrow, Candidate Search. My world didn't just crack, it detonated. Below the letterhead was a report, and another. and another. They weren't adoption papers. They were invoices, background checks, and chillingly, photographs of other children. Dozens of them, with a single, brutal word stamped over their faces in red ink: mismatch. Then I found a separate envelope. Inside was my own baby picture, and beneath it, a final report. The last line read, Candidate 7B, Kira, confirmed 10 of 10 HLA match, acquisition approved. This was not a file about a baby girl who was chosen for love. This was a file about a perfect specimen that was sourced. What is the sound of a life breaking? It isn't a dramatic crash. It is the silent, rustling turn of a page. I sat on the floor of my father's study, the air growing thin and cold, and I read. The words on the reports from Sterling Investigations were not the language of love. They were the language of acquisition. Clinical, detached, and brutally efficient, they laid out a search, not for a daughter, but for a biological product with a specific set of attributes. A project, codenamed Project Marrow. I read about their despair after Leo's first diagnosis, about the frantic, failed search for a donor in the National Registry. I read how, with time running out, they hired a private agency that specialized in discreet sourcing. The documents detailed the agency's process, scanning adoption databases, cross-referencing public health records, looking for newborns whose genetic markers could be obtained and tested. Was my entire existence the result of a desperate, unethical business transaction? The question itself felt like a violation. My life had not begun with a choice to love me. It had begun with a checklist. With each page, the narrative of my 28 years dissolved. I saw the faces of the other children, the ones stamped mismatch. There were 6 of them before me. 6 other lives they had briefly considered. 6 other destinies they had probed and discarded because their blood wasn't right. I wasn't special. I wasn't chosen. I was simply the first candidate who met the technical specifications. The words, confirmed 10 of 10 HLA match, were circled in red ink. A perfect score. Then came the invoices, the payments to the agency, itemized and dated. The cost of finding me. The legal fees for expediting the adoption. The whole thing was a budget line in the grander project of saving their son. And there, at the bottom of a page dated just weeks before my first birthday, was the final entry. Acquisition complete. I was an asset they had acquired. My heroic donation at age 5? It wasn't a spontaneous act of sibling love. It was the entire point. It was the reason I was sleeping in their house, eating their food, and calling them my parents. It was the fulfillment of a contract. My mind began to spiral, frantically recataloguing every memory through this horrifying new lens. Every birthday party, every Christmas morning, every word of praise. Was it real? Or was it upkeep? The careful maintenance of a priceless medical resource. The story of my heroism wasn't a story told to make a little girl feel special. It was a lie constructed to ensure my compliance, to groom me for the role I was born. No, procured, to play. The perfect family, the boundless love, the story of being my brother's other half. It was all just beautiful, elaborate packaging for the ugliest truth I could possibly imagine. I don't remember walking up the stairs. It was more like floating through a nightmare. The thick runner on the hallway floor muffled my footsteps, as if the house itself was conspiring to keep this moment a secret. The file felt impossibly heavy in my hands, a tombstone engraved with the truth of my life. I stood before their bedroom door, the polished brass handle cold against my palm. For 28 years, this door had represented safety and love. Now, it was the entrance to a courtroom. I didn't knock. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the faint light from the hallway carving a path across the floor. They were sleeping, My father's steady breathing, a low rumble in the quiet room. For a heartbeat, they were just my parents, vulnerable in their sleep, and a wave of grief for the family I thought I had washed over me. Then the feeling was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I walked to the bedside table and switched on the lamp. The sudden, harsh light flooded the room and my mother stirred, blinking against the glare. "Kira? Honey, what's wrong? Is it Leo?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. My father sat up, rubbing his eyes, his confusion quickly turning to alarm as he saw my face. And then he saw the folder in my hands. I saw the recognition dawn in his eyes, followed by a wave of something I had never seen on his face before. Pure, undiluted fear. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice a low growl, but there was no authority in it. It was the sound of a king watching his castle burn. I didn't answer. I simply stepped forward and placed the folder on the bed between them. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rustle of the pages as my mother's trembling hand reached out and opened the cover. Her eyes scanned the first page, the letterhead from Sterling Investigations. A choked, guttural sound escaped her throat. The facade of the perfect, loving mother didn't just crack, it disintegrated into dust. She looked at me, her face a mask of horror. "Kira," she began, but the name was a shattered thing. Then came the confession, a torrent of words tumbling out in a desperate, ugly flood. "We were desperate," she cried, clutching the sheets, her body shaking. "Leo was dying. They told us he had months, maybe a year. We looked everywhere, in every registry, and there was nothing." Her voice rose, becoming a hysterical shriek. "We would have done anything to save our son, anything." She was pleading, but who was she trying to convince? Me or herself? "But we loved you, Kira. I swear to you, the moment I held you, I loved you," she sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "It started as a plan. Yes, a horrible, desperate plan, but it became real. We love you." My father sat beside her, silent and gray, a statue of a man. Did they really believe that? Did they think that love could be a bait and switch? Her words were just noise, the frantic excuses of a stranger. In my mind, I saw the invoices. I saw the pictures of the other children. I saw the final report, acquisition complete. Her desperate confession didn't feel like the truth. It felt like the final, most insidious lie of all. I didn't run. I didn't scream. I simply turned and walked out of their room, closing their door with a soft, final click. I walked down the hall to my old bedroom, the room I had slept in from the day they brought me here until the day I left for college. I closed that door too, and for the first time in my life, I turned the small, brass lock. The click echoed in the silence, a sound of separation, a line being drawn in the sand of my life. Is a place still a home when you have to lock the doors to feel safe from the people inside it? The room was a museum of my own fabricated history. On the bookshelf sat the stuffed bear I'd won at a carnival, its button eyes seeming to watch me with a new, vacant stare. On the wall hung a framed photograph of a smiling 6-year-old me on a pony. Every object in this room was a prop, a carefully chosen piece of set dressing for the role I was playing. They weren't gifts of love, they were investments. They were the adornments for their prized possession. My entire childhood was a beautifully curated lie. My gaze fell on a stack of photo albums on the desk. My hands, moving as if they belonged to someone else, opened one to a random page. It was a picture from a vacation in Florida. Maybe I was 10. We were all on the beach, arms around each other, squinting into the sun. We looked so happy, so perfect. But what was behind my mother's smile? Was it love for her daughter? or was it the profound relief of a woman whose son's life insurance policy was standing right next to her, healthy and tanned? I sank to the floor, leaning against the bed where I'd had countless bedtime stories read to me. Stories of heroes and chosen ones. They had made me the hero of my own story, the brave little girl who saved her brother. But it was a fraud. My heroism was a transaction. My bravery was a condition of my acquisition. Who am I, if not the person they told me I was? I am not a daughter. I am not a hero. I am a contingency plan. I am a biological failsafe. The most horrific thought began to solidify in my mind, its edges sharp and cold. They had raised me with such care, protected me, educated me, nurtured me. Why? To keep their investment safe. It was the same care one might give a classic car kept in a climate-controlled garage, taken out only when needed. I was a spare part, a perfect, pristine organ living inside a girl they had decorated with love and affection. My life wasn't a gift. It was a beautifully wrapped package containing a life-saving medical supply. I lost track of the hours. Daylight bled into a gloomy dusk outside my window, and still I sat on the floor, the locked door my only shield. I could hear them outside in the hallway, muffled whispers, my mother's occasional broken sobs, the heavy, impatient pacing of my father. They were a storm gathering just beyond my flimsy defenses, and I was the calm, empty eye at its center. They were grieving the loss of their control, not the loss of their daughter's trust. The first knock was soft, hesitant. "Kira, honey, please open the door," my mother pleaded, her voice thick and unnaturally sweet. "We can talk this through. I know you're hurting. We're hurting too." Her words were a lie coated in sugar, and I felt nothing but a cold, hollow echo where my love for her used to be. The pain she spoke of was not for me. It was for her crumbling plan, for the inconvenient humanity of her perfect donor. I remained silent, pulling my knees tighter to my chest. For hours, their apologies came in waves, washing against the locked door. They were sorry for the lies, sorry for the pain, sorry they didn't tell me sooner. Each apology felt like another manipulation, another calculated attempt to find the right combination of words that would unlock the door and deliver me to the hospital. When their pleas and promises of love failed to work, a new, more menacing silence settled in the hallway. Do you know the difference between a sad silence and a furious one? I was about to find out. Sometime later, the pacing stopped. I heard the sharp, urgent ring of the house phone downstairs, followed by my father's clipped, low tones. I couldn't make out the words, but the subsequent silence was different. It was sharper, more frantic. The storm had just been upgraded to a hurricane. When the footsteps returned to my door, they were no longer hesitant or pleading. They were heavy, angry, and purposeful. The time for apologies was officially over. This time, the knock was a hard, impatient bang that rattled the door in its frame. It was my father's fist. "Kira, this has gone on long enough," he said, his voice stripped of all pretense. It was cold, hard steel. "We just got a call from the hospital. Leo's white cell count has plummeted. He's running a fever. They're moving him to the ICU." He paused, letting the words sink in, a calculated blow designed to shatter my resolve. The pressure was no longer emotional. It was a ticking clock. I remained silent, my back pressed against the door as if I could hold back his words. "What difference does it make how it all started?" he demanded, his voice rising, cracking with a rage born of pure panic. "Right now, your brother is dying. Are you going to let him die, Kira? All because of your hurt feelings?" My mother's voice joined his, a desperate, sharp harmony. "He's your brother. You can't just let him die." And there it was, the final clarifying truth. My pain, my shattered life, my entire sense of self. It was all just an inconvenience, a case of hurt feelings getting in the way of a medical procedure. They weren't asking a daughter to forgive them. They were demanding a piece of equipment perform its function. What do you do when the last good person in your life might be part of the lie? My father's ultimatum, "Are you going to let him die?" echoed in the locked room, but it had the opposite of his intended effect. It didn't break me. It focused me. I realized with chilling clarity that I couldn't make any decision until I looked my brother in the eye and knew, for certain, where he stood. Was he the innocent beneficiary of their monstrous plan, or had he been a silent, complicit partner all along? The question was a shard of glass in my heart, and I knew I had to pull it out. I unlocked the door. The sound was unnaturally loud in the silent house. They were downstairs, waiting, and they heard it. By the time I reached the bottom of the staircase, they were standing in the foyer, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and raw, desperate hope. My mother took a step toward me, her hands outstretched. "Oh, Kira," she breathed, a wave of triumphant relief washing over her features. They thought they had won. They thought their emotional blackmail had worked. I walked past them without a word, pulling my car keys from my purse. The silence was my answer. The drive to the hospital was an out-of-body experience. The city I loved, the city whose skyline I had helped shape with my own designs, felt like a movie set. The lights of the skyscrapers were cold and meaningless. On the passenger seat next to me lay the folder from Sterling Investigations. It was a snake coiled on the leather, its venom having already poisoned my entire past. Now I was carrying it to poison the present too. I didn't know what I would do if Leo's name was on any of those documents, if he had known, even as a teenager, the true price of his own survival. The ICU had a smell all its own, a sterile chemical scent layered over the faint metallic odor of sickness. It was a place where life was measured in beeps and drips. I found his room and paused at the door, peering through the small glass window. He looked smaller in the hospital bed, diminished by the web of tubes and wires that tethered him to the machines keeping watch over him. His face was pale and drawn, but his eyes lit up when he saw me. That small flicker of pure, uncomplicated joy was a gut punch. He was happy to see me. He didn't know I was the harbinger of a truth that would destroy him. I pushed the door open and walked in, the folder clutched in my hand like a shield. "Kira," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "They said you were upset." I was so worried. I pulled a chair to his bedside, my own heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I couldn't bring myself to speak, so I simply held out the folder. "What's this?" he asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Just read it," I said, my voice barely audible. He took it, his thin fingers fumbling with the cover. I watched his eyes move across the first page, then the second. I watched as confusion turned to disbelief, and disbelief curdled into a dawning, sickening horror. The color drained from his face, leaving it a waxy, translucent white. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, swimming with a shame so profound it was like a physical blow. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. "No," he whispered, shaking his head, his gaze fixed on my face as if he were seeing me for the first time. "Kira, I didn't know. I swear to God I never knew." The folder slipped from his grasp, spilling its poisonous contents onto the thin hospital blanket. He saw my life, reduced to a project code name and a series of invoices. He began to sob, not the quiet tears of sadness, but the racking, ugly gasps of a man whose soul was breaking. He reached for my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "All these years," he choked out, "I thought you were my sister. My hero." He looked at me, his eyes pleading, begging me to believe him. "Don't do this," he whispered, his voice raw with shame and desperation. "Not for me. Please. After this, after what they did to you, you don't owe me anything. You don't owe me a single thing." What is the true weight of a word? My father's ultimatum, "Are you going to let him die?" was a bludgeon, meant to shatter my will. But Leo's words, "You don't owe me anything," were something else entirely. They were a key. In that sterile hospital room, watching the raw, selfless shame on my brother's face, I felt a profound and seismic shift inside me. He wasn't asking for a pound of my flesh. He was giving me back my life. He was the only person in this entire sordid mess who had truly seen me, not a donor, not a hero, but a person who had been wronged. His absolution was the one thing I hadn't known I needed. It severed the puppet strings of guilt and obligation that my parents had so expertly woven into my soul for 28 years. My father's question was a threat. My mother's tears were a manipulation. But Leo's release was a gift. And it was in that moment of being given a choice by the one person whose life depended on it that I understood. The decision to save him could not be for them. It could not be made out of the ghost of a love I now knew to be a lie. It had to be for me. It had to be my own. I left the hospital, walking out into the cold night air. The city felt different now. The buildings I had designed, the streets I had memorized, they were no longer just a backdrop to a life I had been given. They were the landscape of a life I was about to claim. The anger was still there, a cold, hard knot in my stomach, but it was no longer a paralyzing poison. It was fuel. I drove back to the house, my purpose clear and sharp as glass. I was no longer a victim in this story. I was the architect, and I was about to redesign everything. They were in the living room, waiting. The moment I walked through the door, they both stood up, their faces etched with a desperate, hopeful anxiety. They looked smaller somehow. The power they had held over me for my entire life was an illusion, and now that I had seen the trick, it was gone. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I stood in the doorway, my car keys still in my hand, and let the silence stretch until it was taut and uncomfortable. "I'll do it," I said, my voice quiet, level, and utterly devoid of the emotion they expected. Relief flooded my mother's face. She started toward me, her arms open. "Oh, Kira, thank God." I held up a hand, a gesture that stopped her cold. "But not for you," I continued, my gaze moving from her to my father. "And not because you demand it. I am doing this for Leo, and I am doing it on my own terms. This is not a negotiation." I let that sink in. I watched them exchange a panicked glance, the control they thought they'd regained slipping through their fingers. "There are two conditions." "First," I said, my voice unwavering, "you will give me every single document you have related to my adoption and to my biological parents. Not just the doctored files, everything. The agency's full, unredacted reports, the names, the contacts, the history you stole from me. You will give me my past." My father opened his mouth to protest, a flicker of his old authority returning, but I cut him off. "Second, the three of us will begin family therapy with a certified psychologist, not to forgive, not to forget, but to live in the truth. You will sit in a room every week, and you will answer for what you did. You will stop lying." I looked at them, these two people who had built my life on a foundation of deceit. They were trapped. Their son's life hung in the balance, and for the first time, the price was not my body, but their comfortable, curated reality. I saw the fight drain out of them, replaced by a gray, weary resignation. "Those are the terms," I said, turning to leave. "You will meet them, or your son will die waiting for a donor who doesn't exist." The choice was mine, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly what I was worth. Have you ever found freedom in the one place you were designed to be a prisoner? I sat in a reclining medical chair, the identical twin of the one my brother occupied just a few feet away. Between us hummed a low, rhythmic machine, the quiet arbiter of this strange ceremony. A thin tube snaked from a needle in my arm, a tether carrying the most vital part of me away. For 23 years, my body had been a contingency plan, an insurance policy held in reserve. Today, right here, tethered to this machine, I was finally claiming it as my own. Leo was watching me, his eyes large in his pale, drawn face. The shame was still there, a constant shadow in their depths, but beneath it was something else. A raw, profound gratitude that needed no words. He had tried to speak when the nurse was prepping my IV line, his voice a dry whisper. "Kira, you don't have to." I had simply reached out and squeezed his hand, a silent message passing between us. "I know. This is for me too. Our parents were not here. That was part of my terms. This room, this moment, was a sanctuary, cordoned off from their lies and their desperate, suffocating love." The nurse, a kind woman with efficient hands, gave me a small, professional smile. "Ready when you are?" she said. I nodded, took a deep breath, and looked at Leo. The machine gave a soft click, and I felt a faint, cool sensation in my arm as the process began. I watched my own blood, impossibly dark and rich, begin its journey through the clear, sterile tubing. It flowed away from me, into the whirring heart of the machine that would separate the stem cells, and then, eventually, it would flow into him. It was a transfer not just of cells, but of a future. I thought of the last time I had done this, a ghost of a memory from when I was 5. The confusion, the vague sense of importance, the praise for being a little hero for something I didn't understand. Back then, I was a passive participant, a child led through a process she couldn't comprehend. I was an object, performing a function. But now I felt every second of it with a sharp, crystalline clarity. Every pulse of the machine, every drop of my own life force moving through that tube was a conscious choice. This was not a sacrifice extracted from me. It was a gift, freely and deliberately given. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We just held hands, my fingers laced through his. His hand felt cool and fragile, yet his grip was steady. It was a silent conversation that said everything. It spoke of the shared trauma of the truth, of the wreckage of our family, and of this one, single, unbreakable thing that remained. He was my brother. That single simple fact was the only part of my old life that had survived the fire. Our bond, I now understood, wasn't forged by our parents' lies. It was being forged now, in this sterile room, in this shared, honest silence. The rhythmic hum of the machine became a kind of mantra. With every pulse, I felt the anger and the betrayal loosening their hold on me. I wasn't the ideal donor anymore. I wasn't the perfect, compliant daughter. I was Kira, a woman who had learned that her life began with a lie, but who was now, in this very moment, building her future on the hardest and most powerful truth of all. By giving a part of myself away, I was, for the very first time, becoming whole. And in that quiet, humming room, holding my brother's hand, I felt an impossible and profound sense of peace. A year. How long is a year? It's long enough for bone marrow to engraft, for hair to grow back, for the specter of death to recede from a hospital room. Leo is in remission, a word that sounds like a fragile truce. He teaches again, his laughter a little quieter now, his eyes holding a new, somber wisdom. Our bond is different. The easy, unexamined affection is gone, replaced by a fierce, quiet understanding forged in the crucible of a terrible truth. We don't need to say other half anymore. We both know what we are to each other. Our family now exists in sterile 50-minute increments in a therapist's office. What does honesty look like after a lifetime of lies? It looks like my father staring at his hands, unable to meet my gaze as he admits his fear made him a monster. It looks like my mother, cycling through a script of apologies that she desperately wants me to believe, her love both the cause of and the poison in the wound. The relationship is a shattered vase, glued back together. The cracks will always be there, a roadmap of the damage. It isn't perfect, but for the first time, it's real. The folder they gave me, the one with the unredacted reports, sat on my desk for months. It was a Pandora's box I was afraid to open a second time. But one night, I did. Inside, past the invoices and the chilling candidate reports, was a name. My biological mother. A woman who, according to the private investigator's notes, had been a terrified, penniless 19-year-old. There was an address, old and likely useless, but it was a start. It was a thread. And for the first time, it was mine to pull. It took me 2 months and another private investigator, one who worked for me, to find her. Our meeting was not a fairy tale reunion. There were no tears, no dramatic embraces. It was two strangers meeting for coffee on a rainy Tuesday. She was a dental hygienist from Indiana with a kind, nervous smile and my eyes. She told me her story, a simple, sad story of poverty and panic. She asked if I'd had a good life, and I told her, "It's complicated." There was no magical connection, no feeling of coming home, but there was a sense of a blank page finally being filled. I left that coffee shop and walked out into the rain, a strange sense of lightness in my chest. I hadn't found a mother. I had found a missing piece of my own story, and in doing so, I realized I didn't need anyone else to make me whole. The architecture of my life had been designed by others, its foundations built on a monstrous lie. But I survived the demolition. I now had the original blueprints. I know who I am. I am not the ideal daughter. I am not the perfect donor. I am Kira, and I am finally free.